Right. Hi everyone, welcome to my talk. I'm Matt, my pronouns are they, them. I'm going to be talking about teaching kids website development in a weekend. If you would like to post about this talk, feel free to use these hashtags. My Mastodon handle is over there on the top left of the screen. It is mattsen@oz.social. Up the top right-hand corner of the screen is the GitHub repository from which these slides live, which has a handy-dandy QR code if you'd like to scan it. And if you go to the README file, you can follow along on the slides on your device, and they will auto-progress because I'm fastidious like that. So, welcome. Oh, let me just reset my timer because otherwise I'm going to have no idea how long things are going for. There we go. All right. Firstly, I'd like to affirm that these are the rightful lands of the Multnomah, Cathlamet, Clackamas, bands of the Chinook, Titulin, Kalapuya, Malala, Tanino, Wasco, Wishram, Paiute, and the many other native people who lived here and have always lived here. These tribal nations belong to and care for this land, and I honour these nations' continued existence and resilience, and their sacrifices are still ongoing. I acknowledge their long-lasting and tireless work to nurture, advocate, and protect these lands of the Pacific Northwest. Okay, so proprietary software. I'm presenting this talk from a Mac running Mac OS, so there's a whole bunch of exciting proprietariness. That is a reminder for my talk that I'm currently delivering. Thank you. But all of the software that I am going to be talking about that has been used for the course that this talk is about is open source, except for an extension used for Visual Studio Code, and I have since, after preparing this talk, discovered that there is a free and open source alternative, from what I can tell, which we're going to test today if I get time to do a demo. So that's going to be fun. Cool. Let's move on. So my experience. I've been a Scout leader since 2008. I really enjoy teaching youth and solving and developing problems, developing various systems. And my background in tech is as a Linux systems admin and software developer. So the overview of this talk, I'm going to go a little bit over my scouting history, how we came up with the idea for this course, the course's objectives, the logistics of how we got things happening, server and client-side details, a little bit of a recount on how our course has run, and some of our lessons learned. So it's going to be a combination of kind of story time and a run-through of the more technical details. So what is Scouts? A lot of people tend to think of Scouts as like Boy Scouts, which is still true to some degree, but has not been exclusively for some time. In Australia, we have been an inclusive all-gender organisation for probably close to 50 years now. We have youth members from ages 5 up to 26. And we don't just do the outdoor stuff like, camping and hiking and building stuff out of wood. Anything the Scouts want is basically what we do. Anything that we can facilitate the Scouts doing is what our goal is. We are a youth-leading, adults-supporting organisation, so we go to the Scouts and we say, what do you want to do? And we try to work out how we can facilitate that and fit it into our award scheme, which Scouts Australia has updated in the last few years such that it is a little bit broader and less prescriptive, so that we've got a bit more flexibility in the ways we, in what is accepted to tick off certain bits of badge work. One of those parts of the award scheme is we have these 6 special interest areas, one of which is STEM and innovation. So Scouts, IT stuff kind of fits under that. So that's what we're kind of targeting here. I've been in Scouting since I was 8. Besides outdoor skills, it taught me how to plan a healthy menu, plan a shopping list, cook, budget, pack for a multi-day camp, pack and tie down a trailer, and lead peers without direct adult oversight. By the way, if I'm talking too quickly or my accent is a little bit frustrating to to understand, give me a shout and ask me to repeat myself, please. So I took a break when I hit 18 to go to university, and 3 years later I realised I was sitting in front of my computer for work and for study and for recreation, and I was like, I had an escape for this a little while ago, so I think I might try and rekindle that scouting involvement. So I did that. I joined scouting as a leader in 2008, working with 11 to 15-year-old kids. And since then, I've also been a leader of adults, which involves like training up other leaders. And I've also been an activity leader running larger, like state-wide activities for scouts of all ages. Is there anything else? Cool. So I then found myself kind of coming full circle, because now a lot of the stuff that I do as part of scouting is sit in front of a computer screen. But it's been kind of good. I think it's a lot more moderate now. I found a good balance. So some of the stuff that I have been doing in that space is developing various web apps to help with like building a registration system for some of our events, because none of the ones that existed really quite fit. And making using open data and open source software to create topographic maps for scout hikes. And so we've used a lot of the web apps that I built have been Django apps using Python. So some of my fellow scout leaders in my team are also tech folks, but ultimately a lot of the maintenance of these particular systems fell to me. And so we decided that even if they were capable of taking over some of it, we're not going to be around forever, so we need to have a succession plan. And so to take advantage of our youth leading, adults supporting mantra, we decided on this idea called Scout Hack. And this is our Scout Hack logo, which is the words scout at hack, $, $ in the style of a bash shell prompt in green text on a black background. So my friend Luke came up with this idea inspired by a hackathon that we have helped run in Australia called GovHack. And so we decided that we'd run this weekend event that was going to be a 2-day camp where we were going to teach the scouts a bunch of IT stuff. And so this happened in the middle of like 2021 while we were still in this huge lockdown in Australia. And so we planned this whole thing over Zoom, basically. Over Jitsi as our video chat platform, so that we could put all of this together over a handful of weeks. And it was all a little bit winging it, and sometimes we operate really well like that, and sometimes it needs a little bit more work. So the syllabus that we decided on was that we were going to teach a little bit of HTML, a little bit of CSS, and an introduction to some server-side scripting, which is ambitious for a weekend when you're dealing with 11 to 15-year-olds, some of whom may have never done anything like this before. But we decided that they don't need to retain all of the details of how this is all going to work. We don't need them to become competent programmers by the end of the weekend. We just need to give them a taste of it so that they can then go away and say, yeah, I want to do more of this. And maybe they will come back to a Scout Hack 2.0 so that we can do some more advanced stuff. Or they might do stuff on their own at home, or try and get engaged with it at school or whatever. So it was literally just a teaser to get people interested, and maybe they would also join our statewide STEM team within Scouting, and then we could get them to do more stuff in this space as well. So the event logistics. We've got our goals. What kind of resources do we need? We need a drink is what we need. So to optimize accessibility, we decided that we weren't going to require BYO device. We didn't want them to have to bring their own laptops or computers. A lot of them didn't necessarily have them. The first time we ran Scout Hack, we did allow scouts to bring their own devices, and I'll come back to that a little bit later. But ultimately what we've standardized on is that having our own fleet of devices gives us a degree of homogeneity so that everybody's working from the level playing field on the same platform, and we don't have to deal with various operating system idiosyncrasies and all of this other stuff that is too much of a headache to contemplate for the tight timeline that we were aiming for. So one of our scout leaders in our team, Andy, had a fleet of Toshiba Tecra M10 laptops. These laptops, Andy tells me, are from about 2009, 2010, so are older than some of the scouts who are going to be using them. But we installed Linux. We used Xubuntu on them, so running XFCE, relatively lightweight, and they do the job just fine. Like, ultimately, we need a web browser and a text editor, and nothing super fancy. So it's all fine. In addition to that, we managed to rustle up a fleet of VGA monitors that we could connect up to each one of them, and an external keyboard and mouse for each, so that the scouts had 2 screens, external keyboard and trackpad for good ergonomics, and it meant that they had like this full experience. This is the setup for the classroom that we had, which shows a classroom space with 2 projector screens and around 20 desks with a bunch of laptops and peripherals. We set them up in pods this year so that scouts could like collaborate with each other, because we're all about working in what we call the patrol system, where scouts work in small groups. So this was to try and incentivize them to help each other out. So the problem that we had was, how do we deal with power for all of these devices? Some of these screens were quite old, and despite being LCDs, actually used quite a bit of power. So fortunately, we managed to book this fairly recently built Scout Activity Centre, which is self-contained by having bunk beds, a kitchen, bathrooms, this large space for the classroom and the dining area, which is the bit behind the camera. And most importantly, in this case, new electrical wiring. So after spanning across, I think, 3 separate electrical circuits, we managed to find enough power to manage all of our devices. We've since managed to get some newer screens that require less power, and it's a little bit less touch and go now. So we managed to avoid tripping any circuit breakers most of the time. The challenge with this camp was that it's out in the sticks, and as a result, there's no internet and very poor cell reception. So how do we teach web development without internet? Well, we decided that we were going to run a local server. So we could have each scout run a server on localhost and then just browse to that, but we wanted to give them a feeling of hosting somewhere where others could access, so we devised some bigger plans. We found an old rack mount server, a bunch of network switches, and a whole lot of network cables. And I decided to give the scouts a full virtual private server type experience, which would allow them to run a web server, install packages, and store files. Each scout got an Ubuntu-based Docker container, an SSH server, which had an SSH server running on it. They had a standard user account, and they also had sudo access to root within the container. These containers were all rootless containers. They didn't have root access on the host, so I made sure that I mitigated any particular ambitious hackers among them. We did this using some tools called SSH Piper, which is, every time I think about it, I cringe, because it is literally a person-in-the-middle attack on Secure Shell that intercepts the traffic, says, oh, what user is connecting, what key are they using, I will work out which SSH server to forward the connection through, which in this case worked really well, but I wouldn't use it in production. So basically we have this one server that's taking SSH connections in. Depending on which user SSH is in, it gets directed to the appropriate Docker container, and they've got their own box. We also used Traffic, which is a HTTP reverse proxy server, which did similar things, such that we would have something.scouthack. So we had this top-level domain that we created on our LAN. And if a scout went to myname.scouthack, they would see their website, and it would get forwarded through to port 80 on their particular Docker container. But how do we teach scouts enough to use SSH without going into all this great detail, which, again, like we've got like a 46-hour event or so. How do we manage to do all of that? The client-side technical details, as I said, we used Ubuntu with XFCE. I needed to install an SSH server so that I could remote in and make changes if necessary. I installed Firefox, I installed Visual Studio Code, and the remote SSH extension, which is the one proprietary extension that we're using. But I found that there appears to be open SSH remote, which is available as an open alternative to that, which seems to work, but maybe is not quite as bug-free. But we'll test it later if I get some time. So I set up one laptop, and then I used Clonezilla, which is an imaging desktop imaging tool, and I imaged all of the other laptops over UDP multicast connection. It took me, I think, half an hour to set up 20 laptops. I love software sometimes. It's really nice. So yeah, that worked really, really well. Given that we already had them on this network, just send it out to all of them. So now that we've got everything set up, let's actually go through the course. So the scouts arrive on Friday evening. We had them assemble their computers, which just involved plugging in their power, monitor, Ethernet, keyboard, and mouse. So not super hard, but it's likely new to a lot of these kids. And so after they've got that all set up, naturally they try to get online because that's what they know, right? And they're like, oh, there's no internet. And we're like, yes, well, let's talk about that, shall we? Let's use this. And the first time we did this, it was very ad hoc. We're like, oh, let's just use this as a teaching opportunity. Why can't you get online? What's going on here? And one of the answers that we got was, oh, we're not on Wi-Fi. And we're like, well, that's technically correct, but do you need to be on Wi-Fi to get online? And so basically we went through the distinctions between Wi-Fi and Ethernet connection, and how they are both a LAN, or local area network, and then we made this distinction between that and the internet, and we said, look, we've got a LAN, which has Ethernet, to which you're connected, and if you want to get technical about it, we instructors also have a Wi-Fi connection that we're not giving you access to because it's got access to a 4G modem, so that it has internet. But you've got a LAN that you're all connected to, and a server that is going to be accessible so that you can share content between yourselves. So we went through that on Friday night, and this is a photo of after they all arrived. So it's the same as the same shot as the previous photo, but the classroom is full of scouts staring at their screens, it worked out pretty well. They had a good time. So after we had gone over the whole network thing, we decided it was getting quite late because they'd arrived at, I think, 7 p.m. So we decided to call it a night, and I was like, oh, what do we do with these scouts to entertain them for the evening? So I installed a mine test server, which, for those who don't know, is an open source clone of Minecraft. Asterisk, there is some nuances there, but that's basically what it is. And I installed a server of that on our server, and each used the SSH connection to all of the clients to install it on them very quickly. And so they were all playing this mine test game with each other, which worked really well, except for one scout who, the first time around, had brought their own computer and felt very superior for having actual mine test TM, and was like, oh, I've got the real thing, and shortly discovered that they were playing all on their own, and network effects came into play, and eventually they said, oh, can you install mine test on my computer for me? So I think that was a really cool experience of being able to promote open source software by using network effects to say, look, we've got all these other people who are playing it, they're having a great time, and you're playing the proprietary one all on your own. Come on over. And they had a great time. Anything else I need to mention on that? No. Cool. So the following morning, after we had breakfast, one of the things that we decided to teach the scouts was, how does a computer work? What does a computer do when you get right down to it? So we used this example that my friend Luke had found from, I think, some computer science course that was being run online about making a sandwich. And on the screen here, I've got the XKCD comic called Sandwich, which says, make me a sandwich. And the other person says, what? No, do it yourself. And then the response is sudo, make me a sandwich. And the person's like, oh, okay. So we decided to leverage this thing and have the scouts teach me to make a sandwich. I have a tendency to be quite literal-minded sometimes, so I was a good candidate to take instructions and interpret them very literally without any kind of intelligence behind things. So this is what we ended up with. This is me being instructed to pick up a knife, but not being told how to pick up the knife. So I'm kind of holding it in a stabbing motion. It's a little bit terrifying. So I was given a loaf of bread, a tub of butter, some Vegemite or jam, a knife, and a plate. And so I was told, pick up the knife, open the jar. And it produced hilarious results until I was told to tone it down a little bit because we really needed to get things done. So maybe I needed to interpret things a little bit more clearly. Eventually, we got to the point of me being able to spread something on the plate while holding the knife backwards. We did eventually get something a little bit more productive done, but this was one of their first attempts. I got instructed to open a jar without twisting it, which worked out as well as you might expect. And eventually we got a completed sandwich, which I subsequently ate, having already had breakfast, which is fine. It's all good. All right, so after we'd had our fun and we'd explained computers do exactly what they tell you to do, and if you tell them to do the thing that you don't mean to tell them to do, they're going to do it regardless, then we decided that we were going to actually get them to open up their computers, set up their coding environment, and actually do some stuff. So we instructed them to, how much time have I got? 20 minutes. We instructed them to open Visual Studio Code, use the remote SSH plugin to SSH to username.scouthack so that they were each in their own machine. And for those of you who don't know, the way this works is Visual Studio Code has these remote plugins where you can use it on a remote machine. So you're using your local editor, but it's editing files somewhere else. And when you run a server on that machine, it's available to whatever that machine has access to. So we got them to set all of that up. We asked them to create an index.html file with just some random text in it. We got them to open a terminal using the Control-tilde keyboard combination, run a Python web server using Python. I should have put this command up on the screen. Doesn't matter, I'll do it later. Python -m http.server space 80. So that's opening a web server on port 80 in the current folder. And then we got them to browse using Firefox to username.scouthack, and they could each see their own files and each other's if they browsed to some other Scout's username.scouthack. So we got that set up. So cool, great. We've published a website. We're done. And also, as I said, that other Scouts can also browse to. So it's got that, it's not just a solo activity. All right, HTML. So to teach them HTML, we scaffolded the index.html that we had already built. We said, OK, we're going to put in some text. Then we're going to add some headings, H1 through to H6 or whatever. Put in some new lines with the break tag. The various formatting tags, bold, italics, paragraph tags, images. We also got them to create a new document and then create a link to it using an anchor tag. Various lists, both ordered and unordered, and a table. So we basically taught them all of the basics. And even if they didn't fully understand them, at least then they had some code that they could copy and paste to use later on. By this time, it was lunchtime because we were done. It was like, this is a whole thing. We've done great. Let's take a break. After lunch, we decided to teach them CSS. So we've got our HTML. Let's style it. So we started by introducing CSS colors. We explained that some colors can be referred to by name. while the rest of them need to be referred to using their RGB color codes or using HSL, which we didn't cover. We didn't cover HSL, but we covered RGB, and we covered that you can reference that using either hexadecimal or decimal. Having done that, we decided to add some CSS to our page. We used the inline style attributes first, just using a style attribute within a tag. Then we got them to move some of their attributes into a style tag at the top of their document. And we taught them a little bit about CSS selectors, so element type selectors, class selectors, and ID selectors. And then we talked about some of the CSS attributes using color, background color, and a couple of others, I think. And let the Scouts go wild, creating really, really garish color schemes that an accessibility expert would cry over. But that's okay, they were having fun, and this was the point of the exercise. One of the advantages of Visual Studio Code in this case was that it shows you, when it sees a hex code that looks like a color, it will show you a preview of the color, and you can click on that and it will actually show you a color picker. So they didn't even need to necessarily know much about the hex codes. They were able to just pick a color in the editor and it would generate the hex code for them. So that worked out really well. It wasn't something that we expected in advance, but it made things a little bit easier. So after we'd gone through that, then we taught them how to move that style tag into a separate style.css file and include it into their document so that they could use it in multiple documents. After we had done that, we decided to accelerate things a little bit using Bootstrap. So we told them to point their computers, their HTML files at an on-site CDN or content distribution network that we had set up so that they could pull in the Bootstrap code, and showed them that Bootstrap has a bunch of pre-built CSS classes that they can add to stuff to rapidly style it so that it looks a little bit less like it was coded in the late 90s or early 2000s. And after they had exhausted themselves styling their websites to the nth degree, then they played more Mindtest and had pizza, as you do at a hackathon, and then they went to bed. Then the following morning, we started to do some server-side scripting. We considered doing JavaScript, but given the time constraints, we decided that it would make a little bit more sense to show them something where they can make a server-side change so that you're actually, you've got to change, you've got a site that has its own state. So people can make changes to it, submit something, and then other people can see what they have submitted. So we decided that was the approach we wanted to take. And the advantage of that was also that we were able to teach some Python, which is, if you remember back, the language that I am using to make all of the websites for scouting stuff. So then I have a whole bunch of minions to help me out with it. So the goal for this particular server-side website was to submit some program ideas for a Scout group's evening activities, and then to list out those program ideas on the screen. So nothing complicated. Here is a form, submit some data. Here is a list that shows all the data that has been submitted. So it was a simple web form that has an author, which is an input box, and an idea, which is a text area, and of course a submit button. And the way I ended up doing this most recently was that I synthesized a Git repository that was me walking through each of these steps to scaffold the website that they had already developed over the last day and add a little bit of stuff, add the Python virtual environment and all that jazz, one thing at a time, so that what I could do was I had this short bash script that I had written, so that while I was teaching the Scouts what I was doing, I was able to hit enter and say, give me the next commit. It would check out the commit. It would reload the page, and they would see what the outcome of this step was going to be. And then I used an open source alternative to GitHub called Fujero to show them the diff of that code on the other projector screen so that they could see what lines they needed to change or add. And I found that worked really well, with some caveats, which again I will mention later. I've also got a link to that repo, but I will send that through later. So the general process for this, how much time have I got? I reckon I've got enough time to do this as a demo. Shall we tempt the demo gods? Yeah, okay, let's do it. All right, that is not the screen that I want that to be on. All right, I need to adjust this a little bit. All right, so over on this screen, that screen down there. No, come on, down we go. Oh, I can't do that because I'm in presenter mode. That one. There we go. All right. So we have, this is not Visual Studio Code. This is VS Codium, which I recently discovered is a clean room build of Visual Studio Code. So it's VS Code with no proprietary stuff in it, built from scratch. So it's basically VS Code, but not in name. So what we're going to do is we're going to go down the bottom corner here, and we're going to connect to host. And I probably need to zoom in a little bit. Let me do that. There we go. Okay, so I'm connecting to a host called matsen.scathack, which happens to be running on my laptop, hopefully, with the username of matsen, which is my handle.
Does that connect to host feature building, or is that already relying on the...
Sorry, say that again?
That connect to host feature that you just uses that built into code?
It's using the extension. It is not showing me anything right this second. What is going on? Okay, I'm going to switch to Visual Studio Code because that was working earlier. And so was this, but that's all right. So what I've got is I've got a set of Docker containers running on my system. The server that I'm connecting to is already running. And I've basically got a small GitHub repository that sets up all of the scaffolding for that. And I am just connecting to an existing host, which has got it's just that Ubuntu host that's got an SSH server and a handful of other packages on it. All right, let's try this again. Connect to host. Without any typos would be nice. Okay, so down the bottom we can see that it is setting up the host. So yeah, I think the open source alternative needs a little bit of tweaking that I haven't quite worked out yet. And I'm going to open the recent code folder that I've got open on that machine, which is going to ask me for my password again, probably. Maybe not. Come on. Don't make a fool out of me. While we wait for that to do its thing, over here on this screen, don't be smart. Okay, so what I've got here is the repository that I was showing the scouts. And so I've got a list of commits here. So there's one down here that is showing this is where your code should currently be at. And what I had done in advance after they had stepped away from their computers was I went through the 20 or so scouts code and checked that it had all of the hallmarks of the things that I required in order for it to be able to be converted into what it was supposed to be turning out as our website, which was a little bit tedious, but basically I just took my code, did a diff between them all, and was like, okay, which things don't match that are important? And I went and edited their code behind their back, and I was like, yeah, they won't care, they won't even notice, it'll be fine, which was the case. But I think was a good call on the basis that they then had a piece of software that was actually going to work. This is really weird the way this is doing this thing, but that's okay. So for example, we've got this one here, which was adding their initial code. So this is the code that was already showing up on their website, which I will open up now that VS Code has decided to catch up. So we can see that I haven't got a folder open at all. Lovely. No, it's not going to play ball. All right, fine. See if I care. We're just going to use a terminal. All right. OK, so entering in my password, code. So we're running a web server on port 80 using the Python command here. And then if I go over to this window and hit that, we can see that I am, in fact, not looking at the right directory for some reason. Probably because I am using the wrong commit. I'm going to mess around with this for another 30 seconds, and then I'm going to give up. Because I know it's not interesting watching somebody fail to do a demo. All right, I give up. I'll see if I can do that some more later. Let me go back to my slides. Somehow, there they are. And my notes, which is over on this screen. OK, so we got them to install Flask. We've got them to create a virtual environment, install Flask, create a website.py, which was going to contain the Flask website, and set that as executable. We got them to move their existing, I don't know if anybody knows how Flask works, but basically it has a set of folders, one of which is templates. So any HTML content goes into the templates folder so that it can be templated out using the Cengia 2 templating engine. And then that then gets pointed to by routes within Flask to say, when somebody browses to this address, template out this HTML and give it to them. So we got them to move their index.html into the appropriate template directory, run the website.py, which runs a web server on port 80 using the template, and then they browse to username.scouhack, and they can basically see their same website, except for the fact that it now has no images or anything in it because they're being stored in the wrong place for Flask. So we're like, OK, it's not quite there yet, so let's put the images into the static directory so that Flask can find them, update some references, refresh the page. Cool, now look, all of your images and your styles are working. Isn't that great? Then we got them to add the HTML form that would submit their program ideas, write a little bit of Python code to store any submissions that they get into a CSV file. And then finally, we wrote some code to parse that CSV file back into Python, template it out as a HTML list or table. I think it was a list with the author and then the content, and then serve that up on a separate page. Which all worked mostly well, except for the fact that the biggest challenge we had were typos. I think that a lot of young people these days, and this is my speculation, but my suspicion is that a lot of young people these days have spent a lot of time using touchscreens and aren't as proficient at using a keyboard and mouse as some of us might have been when we were, closer to their age, or, when we, like 15 years ago or whatever, if that was when we started using computers. Like, I think that as a result, they haven't necessarily got the dexterity and motor skills to type accurately, despite the fact that we said to them, you need to double check what you have typed to make sure that it matches everything that we've got here exactly. We ended up with some weird errors, and I'll go into a bit more detail about that later on. Cool, I'm on time. So after we had finally gotten their website up and running, which ultimately worked out about as well as the demo that I just did, except that we did eventually get there. We left the Scouts some opportunity to tweak their websites as they wished, and then we had them shut down their computers, disassemble them, pack up their gear and head home. And what we promised to do was that we would zip up their website and email a link of it to them so that then they could go and download it and continue developing it on their laptops at home or on their computers at home if they wished. So some of the lessons that we learned while doing this was, as I mentioned, the typos. This was not a big deal with the HTML and the CSS because they're relatively forgiving languages. You're still going to get something on your page, even if it doesn't look exactly the way you intend it to. Whereas Python was a lot less forgiving, and they would get this, cryptic syntax error that they had no idea what to do with. And it was difficult because there were, 3 instructors and about 20 Scouts. We didn't really have the person power to properly help them all debug it in great detail. So what I ended up doing was, for a lot of Scouts, I'm like, okay, what is your username? Let me SSH into the server, do a diff between your code and my code, work out which bits don't match and which of them is the culprit, and then just fix it in place without having to go through the detail with them so that they had something that worked. Because again, our objective is to not to teach them all of the things, but to give them enough information for them to decide whether this is the thing that they want to be doing more of in future. One of the things that I would like to do in future is use Workzug as a debugger, which is something that I discovered at the last event. Workzug, which is a component of Flask, or used within Flask, has an in-browser debugger that will open an interactive shell, like Python shell, where you can say, what does this variable currently equal? And so while it might turn out to be a little bit too much effort to walk the Scouts through that in this particular course, I think that it has a lot of potential to help with debugging in future. So I'm going to work out how I can leverage that. Winging our coursework worked fine the first time around, but to reduce ongoing effort, we want to have a slightly tighter material. One of the challenges that I had the most recent time around was with that Git repository that I had. It was expecting a certain starting point that the Scouts had, and because the HTML and CSS components of the course had been done slightly differently this time around, they did not have the code that I expected them to have, and so I had to go and make a bunch of changes to it overnight just to ensure that we were on parity with the starting point, which was a bit of a headache. But once we tighten up those first 2 bits of course material as well, I think that it'll be a lot easier for us to churn through this. The other thing was that even despite having gone through all of the Scouts code and made sure that everything looked fine, the next morning when they started doing some of the the Flask stuff and moving their HTML file into a template, I found that some Scouts had somehow managed to delete huge blocks of code out of their file and save it without noticing. So I assumed that maybe they like selected stuff with their mouse and actually didn't accidentally hit a key and then just wiped a whole bunch of stuff, which, once worked out was easy to fix because I'm like, oh, let's just pull it from somebody else's code. But it certainly threw me a little bit to begin with. So that was a thing that we needed to work out how to manage a little bit better as well. And I think maybe having a clear starting point at the start of each session so that we're going to throw out the code that the Scouts have done, even though they might have customized it a little bit, and say, you're going to start with this now, so that we know that at regular intervals, we're going to be caught up at the same spot. Using a web-based editor is the other thing that I was thinking about. So we were talking yesterday about the possibility of using Jupyter Lab, which can be used for web development as well, or the Open VS Code server. So it's basically Visual Studio Code in a browser. One of the reasons we picked VS Code is that Scouts can go home, install it on their computer, and have it all work. Whereas if we were using a server-side solution, that's non-trivial for them to do. So each has their pros and cons, and I'm still weighing them up, and we might do something different with each of them in future. So we had very positive feedback from the Scouts and their parents. We've had several returning members. I heard last night that one of the scouts who has been to 2 of our events was asking last weekend whether they could come to a third and when it was going to be, please, which is great. And what we've done with them in the past is the returning scouts, we've had them work on their own projects. Like, cool, you know a little bit of Python, go ahead and make something for yourself and, give us a yell if you need any help with anything. But keep in mind, we're going to be prioritising the new scouts, but we will try and help you where we can. We intend to offer a Webdev 2.0 course, which covers either more Flask or maybe Fast API, which is similar to Flask in its functionality to some degree, or moving on to Django, which is a little bit more powerful and a little bit more complete when it comes to databases. We've also considered doing a DevOps 1.0 course where we teach, so you've got a server, let's install a web server on it, let's, update the packages and all that jazz. I don't know how interesting that'll be, but we're going to do some surveying and work out what people are interested in. And the other thing that we were thinking about doing was like an information security red team, blue team type thing. So basically a capture the flag type thing that one of our friends, Neil, who has run a cybersecurity company, was suggesting that we could do in future. So that could be a whole lot of fun, and I think the scouts would really love it once we can get together some material that feels accessible to them. So we're looking forward to future courses and seeing what comes out of that. And that's basically all I've got. I'd like to thank Luke Burns, who is the person who came up with this ridiculous idea. That's his Twitter handle. I'd like to thank Piper Cafe, who down in Southeast Portland and where I got most of this talk written. I'd like to thank Fossey, and I'd like to thank Andy King, who put together all of these photos that we used. And that's all I've got for you, unless we decide that we want to spend a bit of time on a demo. But I think we're pretty short on time, so we might have time for maybe 1 or 2 questions. Yep.
So you mentioned typos as one. Conceptually, what was the other stuff that folks struggled with the most?
I don't think so the question was, one problem was typos. Conceptually, what other challenges were there? I don't think that there were a huge amount of other challenges because none that we really focused on too much because they weren't super relevant to getting something visible to do. Like, some of them might have gone into detail and been like, oh, how do I style my website to do this thing? Or how do I, alter my list a little bit or whatever. So we got a lot of questions about a lot of different stuff. Unfortunately, we didn't have a huge amount of time to cover them off. And I think some of the other stuff that we had that was functionally relevant was indentation in Python. You've got this whole thing and it's not part of the function that you intend it to be part of because you've outdented it a bunch. So that was it was once we got to the Python stuff that things started to get a bit more challenging, but it was mostly some type of typo, whether it was a lack of understanding or what. But because we weren't really getting into the core concepts of here is exactly how the programming language works, ultimately what it amounted to was typos, even if it was more indicative of a misunderstanding of the language.
So you said that what it did was save ideas and then display them?
Yes.
So what did you just use a file? What kind of...
I used the question was, I used creating the Flask app, it stored some information and then retrieved it. How did I store it? I stored it in a single CSV file. I'm going to see if I can pull it up real quick now that I've got a tiny bit of time. I'm going to go over to this window. And we're going to go back up to here and click on desktop 3, and we're going to get out of that full screen thing and go over to here and refresh that. I reckon that I have got 2 web servers running or something. That's probably what's going on. Oh, no. Let's run the right command. Okay. Ignore the big warning about a development environment. Ta-da! Okay, so this is the website that we put together for our Scouts. So we've basically, we've got a bunch of lists, we've got a bunch of different styling, we've got an image that we've inserted, and down the bottom here, we've got a list of upcoming events. So if I go to suggest an activity, I can say Matt has suggested speak at a conference. And apparently enter does not submit. And it gives me an error message for some reason. Module CSV has no. Oh, because there is a typo in my code. And I see exactly which typo it is. Let's fix it. Yeah. Come on. DICT. Not that one. This one. Oh, and now I've inserted a character that I didn't want online. Look, it's not a conference talk if I don't do a live demo that has a bit of fun. There we go. Program idea has been submitted. Oh, so this is the program ideas here. So we've got a brand new idea. Let's add another one. Fix your code. There we go. So basically, the code that we are looking at is over here in this Flask thing. It's a 50-line file, and we've got a couple of routes. Basically, all they're doing is we're writing each line to a 2-column CSV. Here is the name, comma, here is the author, comma, here is the content, and we're writing it out to a file, and then every time the other page gets refreshed, it gets read out of the file, appended to a list, and then displayed as part of the template. So it's really, really simple. I considered storing it in a JSON file, which also worked, but it was like a couple of lines more code, and it was less human readable. Whereas in this case, they could literally open it up and say, "Oh yeah, cool. Here is the text with a whole bunch without a whole bunch of weird punctuation." So yeah, I think that worked really well. Any further questions? Yep.
How much variation do you see in the background computing skills of the kids? Were there any kids who weren't such savvy?
So the question was, how much variation did we have in the skill sets of the kids? It was fairly significant. Some of them had done some degree of coding themselves, whether it was using JavaScript or some block programming language or Python. Some of them had no idea, and some of them would go and hack on their own code and go above and beyond. And some of them struggled to work out where to create this directory. And that's another point that I didn't mention in my slides, is that a lot of these kids didn't seem to have a full understanding of the concept of a file system either, because again, on a lot of mobile devices, you download files, they go into the downloads directory, you're done. Whereas when you've got an actual file system hierarchy, they haven't necessarily had to deal with that as much these days. Even in something like Google Drive, you just search for stuff and it shows up. So yeah, I think that we should probably wrap up unless there is one other quick question. Cool, thank you all for your time. As I said, I've got all of my slides on the internet. Feel free to chase me up afterwards and enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you.